Hendricks, and I'm the chairman of the Strategic Advisory Board. And I have the pleasure to stand here to introduce Nigel Edwards. But before I do that, I just want to remind you that during this lunchtime there are two additional events happening. In our special interest session, Carl Kalkman and Ian Leistkop will be introducing you to Air Medic Sky 1, an interactive video game which teaches patient safety principles and techniques. This is in room 243 on level 2. Wow. Air Medic Sky 1 teaches patient safety. Fantastic. In our networking area, at the back of the exhibition hall, the theme today is patient organizations. So if your work involves patients' organizations, we invite you to collect your lunch and join the informal discussion. Thank you very much for joining us this lunch hour, and I'm sure that we will have a fantastic time together with today's presenter, Nigel Edwards. He's a senior fellow at the King's Fund think tank and the director with the global healthcare group of KPMG. So help me to give Nigel a big hand and have a good time.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I want to pick up a number of themes that Maureen laid out in the last session, if you were here, and in her opening plenary, about the need for improvement at all levels of the system. Because my basic thesis is that from work that I've been doing with the King's Fund, with Richard Bomer from Harvard, and with the WHO Regional Office for Europe, many of the delivery systems that we currently operate are broken. Clinical innovation has not kept pace business model innovation has not kept pace with clinical innovation. We have the business models of the 1950s delivering 21st century healthcare. But the scale of the challenge we face is huge. And we need new models, but the path is uncertain, and we've only got some of the answers. So I apologize in advance for perhaps posing some questions, and I'll give you some ideas, but I'd be really interested in hearing what you've got and what we might come back. So we all know the challenges. I won't run through them all. You hear these all the time. I will just say one thing, is that aging is only actually a part of the problem. Quite a lot of the problem are the decisions that we take, either as policymakers or as clinicians, to do more to put up the prices and in what we provide and what we authorise. So some of this is under our control. Quite a bit of it isn't. Multimorbidity, rising expectations, the very worrying rising trend in antimicrobial resistance, the increase in risk factors that you all know about, like obesity, and some particular problems, of course, with the workforce and with economics. The European Union think that by 2020 we will be short 1 million healthcare workers in the European Union. If India introduced the British model of primary care, it would need 25 million doctors that aren't in existence. And if you look at long-term care, this number doubles. The USA is already experiencing some significant shortages, particularly in primary care, which is a disappearing discipline, as many of you will be aware. But there's some good news. The good news is we might be able to fill this gap. There are things we can do. KPMG will be producing something on this which will give you some clues, but unfortunately it also contains some bad news, which is we can't afford to pay for it. So sorry about that. And here's the reason. If you look at the way we've been growing over the last 20 years, typically across the OECD, healthcare growth has outstripped GDP growth by about 0.5 to 1.5%. This is just not sustainable. It's still the case in the US that insurance subscriptions go up way ahead of earnings. At some point, this has to come to an end. And it looks like, although we've been predicting this for some time, we are coming to the end of the good times. And we are facing, in most of the Western economies, a period not of 2 or 3 years of austerity, but of prolonged austerity that does not appear to have an obvious end. And even when it does, it's probable that the appetite for taxpayers, insurance subscribers, for large double-digit increases in their premiums or taxes are going to be exhausted. And so we do healthcare reform to try and solve this. But a real oddity about healthcare reform is it often doesn't actually talk about providers at all. I have a theory that an awful lot of healthcare reform is trying to change the behaviour of doctors and other clinicians, but without ever having a direct conversation with them about it. We change things and we hope they'll behave differently without saying to them, actually, the world needs to be different. And what needs to be particularly different to some of the business models that we operate, the delivery systems that we work. Which means, echoing Maureen's opening address, we need not just change at the microsystem level, but also in the workforce, in the organisation of the way that providers work, in the wider system, and then, of course, because the policy frameworks we have often hold us back, they need to change as well. Let's start with hospitals. We've got a lot of hospitals in Europe. There's a lot of variation. If you throw a brick in France, you'll hit a hospital, it would appear, according to this graph. The Dutch, the British and the Israelis have reduced the number very significantly. That seems to be the long-term trend. But there's some really big problems with hospitals. We know that quality and volume are related. So we also know that a lot of our hospitals are not specialist enough now to deal with the complex cases that they are asked to deal with, the very specialist cases. Vascular surgery, for example, being one which has been subject to a lot of review and centralisation in the UK. But unfortunately, because our patients often have multiple morbidity, they're often got too many silos to really reflect the needs of our patients who don't unfortunately map on to the way that we've designed the hospitals. Many of them are not very safe out of hours. They're run by very junior staff, often with limited experience, and they're based on some very odd design rules. If you're a Martian and came and inspected many of our hospitals, you would go away with some strange ideas. So they're organised around the discipline of medicine very often, rather than the problems of the patient. In many countries in Europe and around the world, they're disconnected from primary care and home care in a way that's extremely unhelpful. They treat repeat admissions of patients that they know as a surprising event. The sickest patients, some of these are funny, you are allowed to laugh, it's okay. The sickest patients see the most junior doctors, who then escalate to someone with slightly more idea about what might happen, until you finally might reach somebody who knows. This is not universal, but certainly features the British system. And we mix different and incompatible activities together, which then compete for shared resources, which cause log jams and delays, which are purely of our own making. They're not to do with the demand patterns of the patients, they're to do with the way we organise the system. And certainly, my favourite odd design principle is one where we batch and queue everyone. If you came and looked at a British outpatient department, and I've been to many others in many other countries, it's the same, you would conclude that its main purpose is the storage of patients. Yeah? These are outpatient departments from the 1920s in Britain. One's a painting by the artist Lowry, the other is Southend Hospital. Many outpatient departments I've been to look like that now. So the patient's stored, something happens for 2 minutes, and then they're restored again, and then maybe sent home. And care isn't planned. It's a random walk through a series of different events which may or may not fit together. I'm sure all of you are familiar with maps that look like that. That's one of the more civilised ones I've seen. And so we have this coordination problem, not just between the hospital and home care and primary care, but within the hospital as well. Here's the Commonwealth Fund data on who has coordination problems. I have to say, when you show this to a British audience, they all shake their head in disbelief. We think there's something wrong with the survey because it shows that we're good. That tells you a lot about the British mentality, but there's something going on here. But you can see we have big problems of care coordination in many systems, and it happens within as well as between different parts of the system. A further problem is the cost structure of hospitals isn't like a normal business. If you lose income, which you generally lose much faster than you lose costs, there's not much you can do about it. Particularly in many single-payer systems or systems with a small number of payers, there's no one to go and get more business from. You have to cut costs, but your costs are locked into overheads, but also because of the interdependency of different types of activities. You can't send the anaesthetist home half an hour earlier because you've lost some work. The costs are very inflexible, which means we've got a very standard solution to this, which is we grow. We solve our problems by growth. You get some more money. You make the argument to the health insurance fund, to the minister, or to whoever. But of course, as I said earlier, the growth is running out. There is not the money to prop up these services. So the next bit of growth you do is you merge. And I don't know how many people have been involved in a merger, but we play a game in the UK, which is someone names me a successful merger, and I'll name them 3 that weren't. And that's about the proportion. And they'll divert you for 2 years, if you're lucky. It may take longer. They don't seem to deliver what they promise. And when you centralise services, you take away the specialists from primary care. They need to support them. And in many cases, a hypothesis here, I'd like to see it tested, are the costs of complexity outweighing some of the economies of scale that we're seeing. So we've got hospitals which are too big to fail, so we can't exit them from the market, but they're too small to create some of the new business models that we need. They're too big to be flexible very often, but they're too small to have the funds that they need to restructure. They're often operating on margins of 1 or 2 or 3% that isn't the spare money to reshape the system. But apart from that, it's all going terribly well. Mental health. Mental health is a huge problem. There's a huge burden of disease, but it's run separately from primary care and secondary care in most countries. In fact, in some countries in Eastern Europe, GPs cannot even prescribe an SSRI. They have to refer the patient to a psychiatrist. You don't see many psychiatrists in many hospitals. We're starting to see more of them, but many of our patients, particularly those with chronic diseases, the elderly, have a whole range of mental health problems which, if they're not dealt with, probably put 5 to 10 days on the length of stay. So they'll have delirium, depression, dementia, addiction, self-harm problems, or possibly several of these all at once. So primary care is a lot about mental health, but often is disconnected from it. And patients, when they actually receive mental health services, often tell us we're not giving them what they want. And of course, it's still very institutionally based in much of Europe. The top one, you probably can't see it there, is Belgium, followed by Malta, the Netherlands. Down the bottom, Italy, with less than 10 beds per 100,000 population for mental health, compared with 160 there in Belgium. So, don't know what's happening in Belgium, but don't behave strangely, I think would be my advice. Okay. Here's a thought. Mental health prisons are mental health providers. There are 2 million people in jail across Europe and the former Soviet Union. 400,000 of them have significant mental health disorders. This is the really shocking statistic. 80% of young people in prison have more than one mental health disorder. By the way, there are 2.4 million people in prison in the USA, which is just larger than the population of Paris, which is a kind of surprising. So problems with mental health, problems with primary care. These are universally, apart from places like Spain, which have salaried primary care doctors, mostly this is small businesses based on 1 or 2 practitioners. They're getting larger in the Netherlands and in the UK. They typically have 10 minutes per patient. They have limited access to diagnostics. They might have a bit of handheld ultrasound, but everything else has to go outside. Then they have information very often, but they're not using it. They're often lacking key skills because the science is moving very, very fast. They see a very wide variety of patients. It's an intellectual miracle that they do, but it's getting harder. And across the OECD, it's being reported that primary care is finding it harder to do the care coordination that is needed for highly complex patients. So this is a challenge. So we have this problem that patients are having trouble getting hold of people when they're not seeing the doctor to get advice. We have a problem in long-term care. In Europe, the number of people with dementia is going to double over the next 10 years, and it's starting to eat up our GDP. The figure at the top is Sweden, which is spending nearly 4% of its GDP on long-term care, and quite a lot of this care is institutional. We've moved quite a lot of things that were in the hospital into nursing homes, and we haven't adapted the system to deal with that. It's going to eat more and more GDP. This is the EU 15 will be using probably something like 2.5% of its GDP by 2060, which may be a figure that's not of interest to many of you, but it ought to worry us. And we can't rely on the relatives. People are already saying we're expecting too much of relatives to care for the people people at home. So we have a problem, and then we have got all the things that we know about what's wrong with the system, the problems of overuse, of underuse, of misuse, of responsiveness, of access, the inequalities that are still rife in many of our systems, huge amounts of variation, many of the reasons why we're here today about safety, the slow spread of innovation. I mean, the list goes on, doesn't it? Perhaps pick out here a theme of the event this week, I think, which has been the problem of paternalism and the absence of shared decision-making and patient participation. And something we don't talk about, actually, in a lot of systems, there is a big problem with corruption. You can't get your doctors engaged in reform if they receive most of their income through informal payment from patients. So there's corruption at the level of the individual clinician-patient relationship. There's corruption up the system with kickbacks and other problems with procurement. And in some countries in Europe which have not moved at all in the last 15 years, this is the reason. And we don't talk about it. It's very interesting, but it's a significant problem. We've got some ideas about what to do. We've heard a number of them, haven't we, over the last day and a half, and we'll hear more. But we're pretty sure you need accountability for a defined population. If you can't look after the population longitudinally, you're not going to be able to improve their health. You need systematic, coordinated and evidence-based care. You need rigorous focus on quality and safety. You need to reduce variation, focus on providers, focus on patients and carers, focus on wellness, and try and reduce those inequalities, and underpin that with some information systems that give you measurement and allow you to give feedback to providers and to clinicians. So we know a bit about what to do, but I think we're struggling. So let me try and give you a few design principles based on what we currently do and what we might think about doing in future that draw on some of the themes that we've been talking about. So perhaps in terms of our relationships with the patients, we shift from treating each episode as a single and surprising event to one where we anticipate, need and manage years of care. One of my favourites is most healthcare systems treat patients as though their time is completely free. So which might be a good thing, but we shift work onto them without negotiating that with them, and waste their time in the most astonishing way. My local general practice, if you want a blood test and it's not a Tuesday, you have to go to the hospital, and you go to a room that's slightly smaller than this, there's slightly fewer people in it. And not one of them appears to have an accessible vein, judging by the time they spend there. My general practice, I've had to pay to park and I've had to pay to drive. My general practice has outsourced the cost of phlebotomy to me. I happen to think that's a bad thing. So we should try and eliminate wasted time and travel. We should stop moving the patients where we don't need to and move staff and information instead. We need to end to batch and queue and do flow. We talked a lot about patients not being a passive recipient of care, but actively managing and participating in their care, understanding the decisions, having a high level of health literacy, being able to participate in shared decision-making, which would then mean we can move away from this principle where patients come at scheduled times when they're told, and instead patients coming and get services when they need them, which might be the point at which they might benefit from them. Particularly in the sort of standard respiratory clinic where patients come at scheduled intervals, there seems to be a need to move away from that. I was struck by Marine's story about the dog. Health services only provide healthcare. Well, maybe they should involve patients and carers and leverage these community resources. And they should follow all the guidelines. Well, perhaps we should pursue the patient goals. I'm very struck by this lady. She's a fictional patient in Belgium, actually. She's one of the few that's not in a psychiatric institution. That's the good news. The bad news is she's got type 2 diabetes, COPD, and some hypertension. And she had a hip replacement relatively recently for her osteoarthritis. And if you put all the guidelines that she has to follow and her carers have to follow together, you reach the conclusion that she would do very little else. This is her drug regime. She's not going to be doing very much else than looking after herself. And this is where this idea of goal-orientated medicine, it's not a new idea, moving away from the idea that there is the challenge is assumption that there's a definitive diagnosis and your job is to maximise the sort of the biological markers of this treatment, but instead of which the dog, this lady's ambition was being able to go shopping with her daughter and have a cup of tea with her friends. Interestingly, when you pursue these goals, it appears that your diabetic control gets better, that compliance with medication improves. It's paradoxical. By focusing on the goal for the patient, there seem to be improvements in a number of other indicators. So that's the patients. There's a whole set of design principles about patients which we already know and which I've collected here from work that you've all been doing over the years and that we see in practice in many great places. What about the provider side then? So I think the key is a primary care platform, but it needs to be one that's bigger, that's got better scale, that moves from isolated individual businesses to federated networks, which probably involves specialists as well, and that builds networks with social care in the wider community. So I have a kind of mental picture here of primary care being a bit like this. Okay. You know about the herding cats thing, okay? So we have primary care, isolated practitioners, and what we're aiming for is that, okay? And with integrated specialists, there we are. So, you can never have too many pictures of cats in the presentation, I feel. I really like the cats. Good. And it also certainly beats the formal one that my slide people gave me. So, yeah. Okay, so primary care is important, and we need to treasure it, and we need to really maintain its ability to provide high-touch knowledge of the patient, longitudinal care. But we need to give it the benefits of scale, and we need to support it with specialists and diagnostics, and make it resilient so that it can. As we heard a great story from one of the participants here about a model in which the GPs, if you want an appointment with your GP, they ring you back and ask you when you would like to come, which I thought was brilliant. You can only do that if you're at scale. Okay. So what about hospitals? Now, this is where I am a little more uncertain about what the answer is. But here's a typical hospital, and it's organised by clinical discipline, as you can see. And the trick here is we want to try and sort of take it to pieces and reconstruct it in a different way that more matches the needs of our system. Okay. So first thing I think here is to integrate home care and nursing homes much more into the delivery system than we have in the past. They've been floated off there. They cause us a lot of problems. They send us patients. Very often in the UK, at the end of the day, when we finally got round to sending an ambulance to collect them, by the time we get them, they're already ill enough to require admission. Some antibiotics earlier in the day or an earlier intervention would have helped us. We need to build ambulatory care which is connected to local hospitals. And local hospitals do a lot less in the future, don't they? I mean, they're probably doing support to primary care, ambulatory paediatrics. They'll have diagnostics. They may do some emergency medicine, but they won't do all of it. And they'll have some urgent care, but they won't be doing trauma and they won't be doing major surgery. And we'll have maybe a smaller number of major centres. But we can't centralise the medicine out of these smaller hospitals in most of Europe because we haven't got the money to do it. We don't have the capital. It's not even clear it's a good idea. There's very little evidence that the centralisation, there's a benefit from centralising respiratory medicine, for example. In fact, there's some evidence that travel is a bad idea in these circumstances. Michael Porter and others think that we should put elective care into focused factories like the Avarind Eye Centre, the famous hospital in India whose name does cardiac surgery, whose name escapes me at the moment. Some benefits to that for factory-type protocolized work. I'd be interested. I haven't seen the evidence that really demonstrates that this is a model that's exportable and scalable, but it looks attractive. And then perhaps some shared resources with laboratories and more sharing of procurement. But this system linked together so from moving the hospital from an individual castle with a moat full of water and its drawbridge drawn up to part of a network. So that it participates in a wider system. And then starting to change the workforce. So instead of escalating from junior to senior, we have a system where you see someone and delegate. Instead of always seeing a doctor, you see the most appropriate professional. Instead of just trying to dilute the skill mix that we always have, really think about whether in some cases you might want to make sure you've got the right people rather than just the cheapest. My favourite one, staff developing workarounds for problems rather than participating in the root cause analysis. How many of your hospitals really stop at the weekend? Hands up. Most of you. Okay. There's quite a lot of evidence that if you go into a UK hospital, and I think this is probably true in other countries, your survival is impeded if it's during the weekend. That doesn't seem right. perhaps we should have senior presence. So medicine 20 years ago was a twice-a-week ward round and stopped on Fridays. It's 3 times a day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I think we need to reinvent the generalist in many of our systems. Oh, right, okay, that's... Good, people like that. I mean, our patients need somebody who can work out which specialist they need, if nothing else, but they also need people who can coordinate their care. And I think there's a sort of natural movement of that in the US with the growth of the hospitalists. Problem with the hospitalists is they stop at the front door of the hospital, so they're still behind the moat. So specialists more about providing advice to generalists in a hospital setting at least. And perhaps interesting question here, not sure about this one. Should we always educate for disciplines, or should we train people for tasks? Someone asked me a question the other day, which they'd seen the Averind Eye Hospital presentation, and they said, do you need to be a doctor to do those cataract procedures? Which is a question I can only ask in an audience where you're a long way away and there's a door at the back. A past president of the Royal College of Physicians said, how much of a doctor do you need to be to do quite a lot of dermatology? Now, I don't know the answers to these questions, but we're not asking them, and perhaps we should be starting to think, given our workforce issues, about whether we should be training some people to do tasks really well, and that would be what they do, rather than try and do everything, which has been a pattern in the past. And a particular issue in the UK, where management is seen as a cost, a group of people who only come to work to frustrate everybody else and to cause chaos. Actually, we should be investing in high-cost management, high-quality management. High-cost management, I said. High-quality management. So I'm not a manager, so I wouldn't benefit. But here's the thing. Much of healthcare management and hospital management in much of the world, and even in Europe, is still the domain of the interested amateur. Who may be politically appointed in some cases. How good is that going to be, all right? Okay, so what this may mean, it probably means more fundamental redesign than we've done at the moment, than just keeping the current model going. We're keeping the current model going because we aren't quite sure what to do about the one we've got, and we don't quite know where the next place is, and getting there looks very hard. We certainly need to align the payment, contracting and regulation systems much better to the new world, and they're very aligned to the old world. We need to invest much more in measurement and feedback than we ever have before. I've mentioned the first one of these. We need to create better metrics that capture the aspects of the system that matter to patients and to populations. And we need to shift from purchasing components of care and inputs to purchasing outcomes and value if we can work out how to do that. And we need to invest in change and encourage some new ideas. That may mean bringing other people in from outside our system and our cosy world in the way that you have in the quality movement from other bits of other parts of the economy, from aerospace, from places like Toyota. And we do need to tackle corruption in a number of countries. It can be done. Estonia have done it, for example. And you know all the change management stuff. I won't insult you by running through all of that, but I will just mention one thing, which is I'm struck everywhere I go by how complex we've made our systems. And perhaps one of the biggest contributions that the type of disciplines that you bring to this world might be is to try and help people strip out some of this complexity and get to a system where, away from a system where, as I've heard a number of times today, even hospital CEOs or medical directors who understand their local system are unable to help their elderly parents navigate it. Okay, so we need to strip away all the layers of initiatives and ideas we've had and perhaps refocus on what really works. And that probably means we do need to invest some money at a reasonably big scale to help the people who are running systems that no longer work find a new direction. And that, of course, means everybody doing it. Thank you very much.
Stay for a second.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Is that all right? Good. Good.